Right, so welcome to the second lesson of the Ecology unit of studying your science course on abiotic and biotic factors. So you should see in your booklet, you're about page 16, and going to be looking at the difference between abiotic and biotic factors today. So if you have a look at the bottom of page 16, you see there are some knowledge recall questions from the previous lesson. So if you could pause the video for a little bit and have a go at those questions and then unpause it, and we will go through the answers together in a moment. Right, now you have unpaused the video, let's just go through and just check off and correct any of the answers that you have put down for the knowledge check for these first 10 questions. So as it says, ecosystems are, if you remember from last lesson, they are an interaction or made up of interactions between the living and non-living parts of an environment. Name two things that plants compete for. You might have a multitude of things, such as water, minerals, light, and space. So, for example, let's put down light and water, both needed as part of photosynthesis. Explain why organisms compete. They compete to gain resources that are needed for what? That are needed for survival. Gain resources needed for survival is why organisms compete. And then if you turn over onto the next page, you will see the remaining questions. Name two things animals compete for. So it can be things such as food and reproductive mates. State the term describing species that coexist together. Remember that coexistence we call interdependence in ecology. Define population. It's the number of organisms of a species living in one specific geographical area. What's a species? Species are biologically similar organisms that can reproduce, and they make fertile offspring. So offspring that themselves can reproduce. Give two examples of stable communities. So ones we touched on last lesson were woodland and rainforest. And then a couple of recall questions from previous units. Describe the structure of DNA. DNA is a double helix molecule. And write the wave equation. Wave speed equals wavelength divided by frequency. So let's go through this lesson content then. As it says, recall examples of abiotic and biotic factors and describe how a community can be affected by changes in factors within the ecosystem. So as the first sentence says, ecosystems are dynamic, constantly changing over time, even during... Let's start the video with a sneeze, that's never a good thing. Anyway, won't bother editing that out. Let's carry on. So ecosystems are dynamic, constantly changing over time, even during equilibrium. If you remember from the last lesson, that was when we said there's a balance to an ecosystem, and you might have relatively stable population numbers, which make up a stable community. These changes are split into two categories: biotic, bios is the Greek for life, and abiotic, which means not. So biotic living and abiotic, not living. So these are factors that can affect a community within an ecosystem. So changes to these affect communities within ecosystems. So if you change one, your population numbers of different species might go up, might go down, depending on how they are affected. Right. Pause the video now, and with your Word document or PDF or anything like that you've got from Milk, find the YouTube video, watch the YouTube video, and then just on spare notes page or your own notebook or anything like that, make a note of any of the key differences outlined in the video of the differences between abiotic and biotic factors and some of the examples of abiotic and biotic factors. So pause the video, have a look at the YouTube clip and do that now independently, and we'll come back and look at the text below in a moment. Right, now that you've done the above task, and we should be able to go through the text below and just expand on some of it ourselves. So as it says, abiotic factors are non-living parts of an ecosystem, such as light intensity, oxygen levels, carbon dioxide levels, temperature, moisture levels, soil pH, mineral content, wind intensity, and direction. Now, changes in these, what might they affect? If you think about things like light intensity, you think about carbon dioxide, then think about oxygen itself, you are thinking that actually changes in these factors can affect processes like, hopefully it's jogged your memory, but light and carbon dioxide, photosynthesis, respiration. If you're thinking all organisms need to respire to live, they need oxygen for that. And also if you're thinking about wind intensity and direction, that can affect transpiration and movement of water from the roots to the leaves and out of the leaves of a plant. So can moisture levels actually as well. So it can have big impacts on these kind of processes. Changes in one or more of these factors can directly affect the size of one or more populations within a community. They can also affect the population sizes of other organisms that depend on them. So as we've said, this is due to interdependence, as it says in the next sentence. Just spotted that. So it's due to interdependence. And you've got to bear in mind that what organisms are depending on each other for. So if you think about things that they might depend on each other for, they might depend on each other for food, predators and prey, shelter and protection. And then if you think sort of bees and plants, they have an interdependent relationship because they depend on each other for things like pollination and seed dispersal. So these are all examples of interdependent factors that different populations might depend on each other for. It goes on to give you a bit more detail below. For example, a decrease in the mineral content of the soil could affect plant growth, resulting in a decrease in its population and also the populations of any species that relies on the plant for food or shelter. Because if you think about minerals, one of the types of minerals that plants get out of soils are nitrates. And nitrates combine with glucose that's produced through photosynthesis to make amino acids. And amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. the building blocks of proteins, which you need more protein to grow. Same for any kind of organism. Whereas an increase in light intensity or carbon dioxide, just move a bit further up. There's an increase in light intensity or carbon dioxide levels. If we just come back to the top up here, just to remind you, could cause an increase in photosynthesis and therefore growth, because photosynthesis produces glucose and it produces oxygen, which, as we've just said, glucose is needed for growth because it helps to produce proteins, which would increase plant populations and the amount of food available for other species, increasing their numbers. Remember, other species that eat plants we call primary consumers. Now, move on a little bit. Biotic factors in an ecosystem. Biotic factors are the living organisms within an ecosystem. Competition within, intra, or between interspecies, as well as the availability of food, can affect an ecosystem. So, first point here, competition, as we've said, is fighting for survival resources. So, intra-specific competition, as we've said before, is between organisms of the same species. Inter is between organisms of different species. Now, affects the availability of food. Less food. Why is that an issue? Because it makes it harder to survive. Competition, availability of food can affect an ecosystem. The arrival of a new predator. Remember, we talked about things like invasive competitors eating the same food source as other organisms that are already within the ecosystem, meaning there's less. Introduction of a new plant species or a pathogen. A pathogen is a disease-causing microbe. The four that you need to know are bacteria, viruses, fungi, and protists. These can also have an impact. If a biotic factor changes, there may be consequences on the population size of other species within the ecosystem. Remember, that's due to interdependence. Due to interdependence. Remember, due to interdependence. Now, for example, in the UK, the introduction of the grey squirrel. Now, the grey squirrel is a good example because the grey squirrel came from America. Into the native red squirrel habitat has led to a decrease in the population of red squirrels. This is because the grey squirrels outcompete the red squirrels for food and shelter. If a new predator enters, the animal population will decrease as more predators are eating them. In extreme cases, competition and/or predation may result in the total loss of a species extinction. I'll come back to that in a minute. Just focus on the grey squirrels. They outcompeted the red squirrels for food and shelter. So there was less for the red squirrels. So there's less food for the reds, but also as well, thinking back to these factors up here, as well as a new competitor, the red squirrels were also susceptible to a particular virus called the parapox virus that grey squirrels are not. So the more red squirrels who got this, the more they died out, the more that there were grey squirrels left over, fighting for the available resources and winning that competition, so that they had the food, red squirrels didn't, and obviously red squirrels' numbers decreased and decreased as more of them died. And if it gets to the point where none are left, the species become extinct. So the species becomes wiped out. An example of this might be the dodo in the Mauritius that became extinct due to humans arriving and bringing dogs that basically hunted them to extinction. Right, now there's an activity to look at how population numbers affect each other due to interdependence. So have a look at the bottom page here. A farmer sprayed fertiliser on his field. Heavy rainfall followed and washed most of the fertiliser from the field into the nearby reservoir. The fertiliser encouraged the rapid growth of algae. Now this process itself, might have come across before, where fertiliser is used, it gets washed into rivers and streams and lakes and makes algae grow, is eutrophication. Okay? The population size of 3 types of fish were monitored over 50 days after the rainfall by recording the quantities of fish caught by local anglers. Just remember, an angler, posh word for a fisherman, someone that fishes. So you've got the information in the table below, and now you'll see on the next 2 pages there are a selection of questions for you to be having a go at. So what I would like you to do, pause the video and have a go at the 6 questions on the next 2 pages to see how much of this table you can interpret. Once you've done that, then unpause the video and we will go through the answers together. So you should have unpaused the video now, and having gone through the questions in the table, if we have a look at the answer for the first question, describe the overall trend in the total number of fish over 40 days. So what happens to the total number of fish over 40 days? Decreases, shows a decreasing trend. Nice and simple bit of data interpretation there. If you look back at your table while you're doing this and just check on the answers. Identify the species of fish with the greatest reduction in population. That was the gudgeon. They decreased the most. Explain why the data for the roach after 10 days could be considered an anomaly. Well, it increased slightly, while the general trend is for a decrease over time. Now, suggest why the data point from question 4 could be a true reading. Now, the reason why it could be true is they could have caught fish at the point of reproduction, where actually fish themselves were reproducing, so the numbers increased slightly. Explain why the population sizes of all the fish were reduced. Because of the increase in algae, the algae took up resources that the fish needed. So therefore they had less resources that they needed, therefore they were more likely to not survive. And then the pike is a predatory fish that eats the roach and the gudgeon. Explain why an increase in the algae did not affect this fish directly. The reason why it didn't is because it still had available food sources in the other fish, until they also eventually died out, so therefore then the pike numbers eventually became affected just over a longer period of time. Right, now let's move on to looking at predator and prey cycles down the bottom. So, let's go through the paragraph together. Predators are consumers that hunt and kill other animals. The animals they eat are called prey. In a stable ecosystem, the community, the predator-prey relationship is balanced. However, if the population of the predator and prey alters due to a biotic or abiotic factor changing in response, so will the prey population. If prey numbers increase, there is more food available for the predators, allowing their population to increase. However, if the prey population decreases, then so will the predators, because there's less food. Predator-prey cycles are always out of sync with each other, as it takes time for one population to respond to the changes in another. Now, think about things like this. So if we have a little look at an example here of a relationship between hares and snow leopards. Now, first thing is that they're out of sync. As one increases, the other's decreased, and then the other increases, the other decreases, or the decreases, the other increases. They're slightly out of sync. But the point to remember here is that over a period of time, populations stay within an expected range. Now, if you have a look at hare and the snow leopard, we should know that the snow leopard eats the hare. But from this graph, what would we be able to say about the population numbers of the hare compared to the snow leopard? They're always higher. And that's another important point, is that the prey numbers are always higher. Because if they weren't, could lead to a greater risk of extinction because there wouldn't be enough hares to go round, and therefore the snow leopards that would be there would basically eat them all up if their number was below that of the snow leopards. Now, I want to have a little look at just breaking this down a little bit. So pop next to each of these a little number, and we'll go through this in stages. 1, 2, 3, and 4. Right. At point 1, what's happening to the hare population? It is going up. So if you've got more hares, simple fact is, you've got more food for the leopards. Now, if you've got more foods for the leopards, what happens to the leopard number at point 2? The leopard number increases. So the more food for the leopards supports the survival of more leopard offspring. Three, as we have growing numbers of leopards, eventually the food supply of the hares starts to decrease. So increase in leopards means there's less available food. And if there's less available food, the leopard numbers decrease because there's not enough food to go around. We get down to 4.4. And the cycle begins again. So they're staying at equilibrium, they're staying within an expected range, they're just fluctuating over time slightly out of sync. Now, there's another term I want you to sort of become familiar with. And come back to this sentence where it says, if prey numbers increase, there is more food available for predators, allowing their population to increase. Now, this is what you might call an indirect interaction across a different trophic level, a different feeding level. And this is what we might call a trophic cascade. And this was a term coined by a biologist called Robert Payne in the 1980s. We're going to look at it at the end, I think, of this lesson just in a little bit. So we are going to come back to this term trophic cascade at the end. So for now, just to finish off with the predator-prey cycles, if you can then turn onto your next page and you will see there are a selection of questions I'd like you to have a go at answering about the predator-prey cycle. However, there are a couple of key points I just want to make you aware of, and this is more from an apology point of view. Where it says fox population here, just scribble that out and change it to leopard. And then same again here, scribble that out and change it to leopard. So pause the video in a moment and then have a go at these questions and then some of the knowledge and application questions on the next page. See how much of them you can have a go at using your resources, using what you've done, and then we'll go through the answers together in a few minutes once you've had a go and we've unpaused the video. Right, hopefully you've unpaused the video now and had a go at those questions. So if we go through the answers to finish. So the graph that we looked at shows the populations of hares and snow leopards over a period of time. Snow leopard number is the predator to the hare. Suggest what may have caused the initial decrease in hare population at the start of the graph. So remember, different things we've said. Can be the availability of food, effect of a pathogen, competition from other species, and also predators such as snow leopard. Explain why the leopard population increases shortly after the hare populations do. Because there are more hare available to eat as prey. So therefore they get more food, they're more likely to survive and reproduce. Explain why there was a delay in the leopard population increase after the hare population. Because the populations themselves need time to gain that food, to gain strong, sort of survive. Then they can then they've got a greater chance of reproducing. They need to reproduce. That reproduction needs to take a period of time, so it needs time to reproduce and grow in number. Suggest why the hare population is greater than the snow leopard population. It's greater so that there's enough to survive. If it was less, they would more likely become extinct. Suggest how the graph would change if the food supply of the snow hare was reduced due to disease. Well, be fewer number of hares because they wouldn't have enough food. And suggest how the snow leopard population would also change. Well, you'd also have a fewer number of leopards because they are obviously dependent on the snow hare for food as a food source. And then suggest why this model of population size is unrealistic of the actual population sizes. Now, this is just taking into account predator-prey relationship. The thing about this model is it doesn't account for the effects of other biotic or abiotic factors. Now, you should have had a go at the knowledge questions as well. So let's just go through these. Abiotic, is it living or non-living? It's a non-living factor. 2 examples, light intensity and temperature. You might have some others such as water, oxygen, carbon dioxide. Define biotic, living factors that affect a community within an ecosystem. Predators are living, also pathogens as well. We might be talking about competition with other species. Then if we go on to our last set of these questions on the next page. Explain why there is a delay in predator response to prey. Because it takes time to impact population numbers. Predators, they are consumers, and they are consumers of prey. Define extinction. So that's the total loss of a species. Define species. So these are organisms that are biologically similar. And they reproduce to make fertile offspring. Now, a couple of questions that we are just recapping prior content knowledge that not related to this unit. So draw a lithium atom. If you were to draw the electronic structure of a lithium atom, you need 2 shells. Remember, if you were to see it on the periodic table, you'd have a 7 and a 3. So you'd have 2 electrons on the inside shell and then 1 on the next shell. Is energy absorbed or released when bonds are formed? It's absorbed. And then suggest why a population scientist could not confirm that it is the changes in predator or prey that's solely down to the population size of the other. It's because less easily measured abiotic and biotic factors can also have an impact. Now, last thing to be having a look at is having a look at this question. So you want to have a read through it, pause the video, have a go at it, and then we'll go through it ourselves. The question says, intraspecific competition is competition within a species. Identify and explain 2 resources that deer compete with each other for. So, pause the video, have a go, and then we'll unpause it and just look at the answers. Right, should have unpaused the video, and if we look through it, it's a 4-mark question. So it's looking for 4 specific points, and have a look and see if you got anything from these. So you could have any 2 from these. Competing for mates in order to reproduce. Competing for food. Why are they competing? For survival. And then competing for territory or space, which is going to give them shelter and access to food and mates. So remember, in this question it says identify. So these are the what. What are the resources? So what resources and explain is the second point, which is your how or why are they competing for these. So remember, that's the question. What are the resources? 1, 2 would give you 2 marks. How or why are they competing for them? They're competing for food survival, reproductive mates in order to reproduce. territory, to get shelter, to get more food and more mates. That's your how and your why. So that would give you your 4 marks in total. So for example, you might have 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's that question. And then just to finish off, the last point that I wanted to just bear in mind and go through with you was the idea of trophic cascades, because we mentioned them earlier in the lesson. It's a bit of extra content knowledge that is worth bearing in mind. Now, you can have a look at it on your notes page. So trophic cascade. There are 2 types. There's a top-down cascade. So, if you think about predators eating herbivore prey. So predators eating herbivores, primary consumers. Now, if you have the predator, if the predator is removed, what happens? The prey population is going to increase because they're not getting eaten. Now, why might that affect an ecosystem? So if you had a prey population that increased because it wasn't getting eaten, you might have it causing overgrazing, overeating of plants, which in itself can bring habitat change and can affect biodiversity. Then your other type of trophic cascade is a bottom-up cascade. Where you might have increased rainfall, for example, which encourages plant growth. If you've got more plant growth, your population of primary consumers or herbivores is going to increase, which means you might end up with more predators moving into an area due to more available prey. So, top-down cascade is what happens when you remove top predators of a feeding relationship of a food chain, whereas bottom-up cascade is where you change or impact the producer population, plants and how they grow. So a little bit of extra biology knowledge there for you that might be worth you knowing in terms of defining feeding relationships and changes within ecosystems. So well done on getting through this lesson, folks.